It was quite the day in Ottawa, and it wasn't just NDPers and Liberals questioning the Prime Minister's strategy on the mess his government has found itself in. Some Conservatives seem pretty upset too. What happens now? Andrew and Bruce are in Ottawa tonight. Chantal is in Montreal. Let me start by, I just got an email from Terry Malevsky, who's on board the aircraft with the Prime Minister heading to Peru tonight. They just landed in Lima, and the Prime Minister didn't say anything during the flight to reporters, so we're no further ahead in hearing what he has to say. That speech has had terrible reviews all around. Could it possibly have resonated with anyone? Andrew?
It's hard to see how, in this current frame of mind, I think that the party has, that the base has. The base has put up with a lot from this government and this leader, but I think that this may be sort of the one step too far. People are genuinely upset within the party, let alone outside. This was remarkably tone deaf, evasive, off-key, didn't answer any of the questions that are on people's mind. And indeed, the lone reference he made to the whole affair was to say that he was upset by it, as if this was something that had happened to him, as if we were supposed to forget that just a few days ago, with the same set of facts, he'd expressed full confidence in his chief of staff. It was, I think, a full-blown fiasco.
Chantal?
I agree. Where the gap really was is it's okay to say this is what I said and promised, but then it didn't begin to answer the question, how did we end up in this mess on your watch? And it seemed like it wasn't happening on his watch. It was something that, as Andrew said, happened to him. I saw it as a sign of disarray at the center. A loss for a strategy, and I think a desperate effort to refocus this on the Senate rather than on the reality that this is over the handling of ethics by the government and the Prime Minister.
Yeah, it seems to have long since passed the Senate expenses tag that this story's had. It's now seems to be all about, if not the PMO in general, Stephen Harper specifically. Bruce, what's your read on it?
Well, fiasco, frantic, desperate, all of those words I think really apply to what we saw today. It was a terrible day for the Conservatives and for the Prime Minister. I think, you know, fundamentally this isn't really about Senator Duffy anymore. It's not really about the Senate. It's not about the economy, as Mr. Harper tried to suggest today, and the need to focus on that. This is about the contract that the Prime Minister entered into with voters in 2006, about his personal trustworthiness on these issues of accountability. People need to hear him apologize, and they need to see him stand and take questions and do the uncomfortable work that is really Accountability 101.
You know, if he got a cheer today in that kind of staged room, it was around the line, you know, if there's anyone in this room who's trying to, you know, make money out of being a Conservative, it's not going to happen under my watch, which was a repeat of a line he said 7 years ago. Watch it from 7 years ago, same line.
I've told my own staff, I've told my own members of Parliament, if any of them have ambitions to use public office to advance their own interests or to get rich lobbying a future Conservative government, they had better make other plans or leave.
Didn't work then, apparently, and it's questionable whether it's going to work now. Can anyone give me a possible explanation as to why he wouldn't answer questions about himself and his own knowledge when he had one of his ministers trotted out a couple of hours later to do exactly that? Andrew?
Well, one possibility is that he'd be put in a position of having to say something that was not true. I was struck that later in the day after the speech, two former chiefs of staff to Conservative prime ministers expressed a high degree of skepticism that the Prime Minister would not have known about this. And look, you know, nobody at any level in the Conservative hierarchy has come out and said this was wrong. This payment of a sitting senator to essentially shut him up was the wrong thing to do. It's all been spin ever since then. That tells you volumes about the kind of culture of expediency that exists within the government now, and the person at the top is the person who bears responsibility for that. If this had been a chief of staff to a minister who did this, the minister as well as the chief of staff would be gone, and it frankly wouldn't matter whether he knew it about it or not, because he would have set the tone that somebody so senior and so close to him would have been following.
Just to point out, those two former chiefs of staff both worked for the same Prime Minister, right? For Brian Mulroney, who was one of those Prime Ministers who wanted to know everything about everything. when he was there. Chantal, you were nodding while Andrew was talking.
Well, I'm not assuming that Stephen Harper was in the loop of this transaction, but I don't think that it really matters at the end of the day, because I think that Nigel Wright was trying to do what he felt was in the best interest of the Prime Minister, so he didn't feel when he was doing it that he was crossing a line, in the same way that it didn't seem to be a problem that Mike Duffy had issues with his expenses. He'd become suddenly someone with great leadership, when it was assumed that he just paid it back. So I don't think the real issue is when the Prime Minister knew what, but rather who is running the government and what is the culture of this government and who sets that tone. And Stephen Harper made a good case when the Liberals were in power that the Prime Ministers of the day were setting that tone. So today, accountability does not stop with John Baird or with Nigel Wright resigning. It has to be the Prime Minister who accounts for himself and his management.
Bruce?
The political risk for the Prime Minister, I think, is this, Peter, that even people last week who were inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt in terms of his role or lack of role in this area are now starting to wonder, given the fact that he won't answer questions about this, just what happened. There are three people, arguably, who know more about what exactly happened than anybody else: the Prime Minister, Mr. Duffy, and Mr. Wright. And none of them are taking questions. And that is going to lead people, average voters, to conclusions that are really uncomfortable for the Conservatives. If they want to deal with this problem, they're going to have to establish their own process for dealing with it, because otherwise they'll be its victim. I
want to understand what you think the role of the opposition is at this point in this kind of a story as we watch it unfold. Here, first of all, you know, a fast sense of what it was like in question period today. Watch this.
Mr. Speaker, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. To Peru, apparently.
This Prime Minister is in it up to his neck, and the members opposite know it.
Was taxpayers' money used to bankroll Senate-gate, yes or no?
Nobody over there even thinks anybody did anything wrong except get caught.
The government's being very clear that the Prime Minister was not aware of this payment until media reports surfaced last week, and let me be very clear on that point.
Speaker, with answers like that, it's like they're taking their crisis management courses from Rob Ford.
Role of the opposition at this point in a story that's unfolding this way. Bruce first.
Well, I think the opposition parties and the media both have important roles to play in trying to force some greater disclosure, greater accountability around this issue. And I think what we'll do is we'll see them play off each other in the next few days. I think the more devastating impact in some respects is the impact that's being felt by Conservatives. I think a lot of Conservatives are humiliated by the substance that they're having to defend or being asked to defend, and as a consequence, not surprisingly, they're not doing a very good job of defending it.
We've never seen the Conservatives speak out like this about their own party, at least in the last 7 years. Chantal, a concluding thought on all this?
It's going to, the opposition play has to take place in question period because it's a majority government and the Conservatives control committee, but I think there is potential for great damage internally with Conservative morale down and the government at a loss with something to change the channel.
Andrew, you got the final word tonight.
There's a conceivable role for the opposition if they would slow down and ask short, simple questions rather than these kind of multiple-part grandstanding theatrics, but they don't seem to be capable of that.
Like what? What are those short questions?
Well, I can't walk through, but it's more in the nature of asking simple questions of fact that put ministers on the record where you can then compare what they said on the record to what they say later. It's more in the nature of the way a lawyer asks questions in court. It's hard for them to resist, unfortunately, going for the big wind-up, the big preamble beforehand, the stream of accusations. And as we saw with John Baird, anybody who's got any experience in this is very adept at just swatting those away. It gives him license, frankly, to give non-answers when you don't ask real questions.
It'll be interesting to watch how these next couple of days play out with the Prime Minister out of town. Apparently, he's going to take a couple of questions tomorrow in Lima, but he'd be standing next to the President of Peru. Those are always awkward situations. We'll see what happens. Andrew, Chantal, and Bruce, thank you all.